Love is not finding someone to live with. It is finding someone you cannot imagine living without. A person enters your life. Nothing about the world changes. The same streets lead to the same places. The same sun rises over the same buildings. Time continues at its indifferent pace. Yet somehow everything feels different. Songs you've heard 1,000 times suddenly sound deeper, as if they were written specifically for this moment. Ordinary experiences like a shared meal, a passing conversation. The way light falls through a window becomes significant in ways you cannot explain. The future, which once appeared as an abstract concept, now contains another face, another voice, another presence that seems to bend the very architecture of possibility around itself. What exactly happens when we fall in love? This question, simple as it appears, opens onto one of the strangest psychological experiences human beings undergo. Because falling in love is not merely the discovery of another person, it is the sudden reorganization of reality itself. A shift so profound that philosophers, poets, scientists, and mystics have spent millennia trying to understand it, and yet it remains in many ways beautifully inexplicable. Most of us believe we know what love is. We speak of it casually, describe it in songs, build entire lives around it. But beneath the familiar language lies something far more complex. Falling in love may be one of the most irrational, destabilizing, and transformative events the human psyche can experience. It operates simultaneously as a biological imperative, a psychological phenomenon, and an existential revelation. And perhaps most strangely, this experience that seems to be entirely about another person may actually reveal more about ourselves than we ever imagined possible. There is a moment, often early in falling in love, that feels like recognition. You meet someone, a stranger technically, someone whose childhood you did not witness, whose memories you do not share, whose inner world has developed entirely separate from yours. And yet, something about them feels familiar. Not familiar in the way an old friend does, but familiar in a deeper, more unsettling sense. As if some part of you has been waiting for them. As if they answer a question you didn't know you were asking. This feeling is not mystical, though it often feels that way. It is psychological. Decades of research in attachment theory have revealed that many of our romantic choices are shaped long before we become consciously aware of them. The patterns of connection we experienced in childhood, how we were held, how our needs were met or unmet, how love was expressed or withheld, create templates that we carry into adulthood. These templates become the unconscious blueprints for what feels right, what feels safe, what feels like home. Sometimes what feels like home is actually what feels familiar. And familiarity is not always the same as health. A person who grew up with inconsistent affection may find themselves drawn to partners who are emotionally unavailable. Someone whose early caregivers were anxious or overprotective may seek relationships that recreate that intensity. We gravitate toward what our nervous systems recognize, even when our conscious minds might choose differently. This raises a question. Do we actually choose who we love? Or does love choose for us, guided by patterns established before we had language to describe them? The philosopher Alain de Botton once wrote that we don't fall in love with people because they are perfect. We fall in love with people whose flaws fit perfectly with our own psychological damage. This sounds cynical, but it points to a deeper truth. Attraction is rarely random. It is shaped by history, by wounds, by the invisible architecture of our emotional lives. So when we meet someone who makes our heart race, we may not be responding to who they actually are. We may be responding to who our unconscious mind believes they could be, based on fragments of the past we carry without realizing it. In the early stages of falling in love, something peculiar happens to perception. The person we are drawn to begins to seem extraordinary. Their ordinary qualities become remarkable. Their flaws transform into endearing quirks. Even their silence carries weight, pregnant with imagined depth. We notice things about them that no one else seems to see. We assign meaning to gestures that may be entirely unintentional. This is not dishonesty. It is something deeper: projection. Projection is the psychological process by which we attribute our own unconscious feelings, desires, and qualities to another person. In love, we often project not just who we are, but who we wish to be. We see in the other person a reflection of our own unrealized potential, our hidden aspirations, our ideal self. The psychologist Dorothy Tenoff coined the term limerence to describe this state, an involuntary cognitive and emotional condition characterized by obsessive thoughts, fear of rejection, physical symptoms of anxiety, and an overwhelming desire for reciprocation. Limerence is not quite the same as love. It is the intoxicating, destabilizing phase that often precedes it. And during limerence, the mind engages in a particular form of distortion. We call this the halo effect. When we find someone attractive, that attraction casts a glow over everything else about them. If they are physically beautiful, we unconsciously assume they must also be kind, intelligent, trustworthy. A single positive trait creates an entire narrative of goodness. Our brains, seeking coherence, fill in the gaps with favorable assumptions. This means that in the beginning, we may not actually be falling in love with a real person. We may be falling in love with an idealized version we have constructed, part reality, part imagination, part wish fulfillment. And yet, this illusion serves a purpose. The beautiful lie of early love allows us to take risks we otherwise wouldn't. It gives us the courage to be vulnerable, to open ourselves, to believe in possibility. The distortion, in a sense, is a feature rather than a bug. It lowers our defenses long enough for genuine connection to take root. But it also means that every love story contains a hidden test. What happens when the fantasy meets reality? When the person we imagined encounters the person who actually exists? Can love survive that collision? There is a reason falling in love feels so consuming, so all-encompassing, so difficult to resist. Neurologically, it resembles addiction. When we fall in love, the brain's reward system activates in ways that mirror the effects of cocaine. Dopamine floods the neural pathways associated with pleasure and motivation. The ventral tegmental area, a region linked to desire and reward, lights up on brain scans when we see a photograph of someone we love. Oxytocin, often called the bonding hormone, deepens feelings of attachment and trust. Meanwhile, serotonin levels drop, which may explain the obsessive thinking, the inability to focus on anything else, the way thoughts loop back constantly to the same person. This neurochemical cocktail creates a state of heightened arousal and focused attention. The beloved becomes the most salient feature of our environment. Everything else fades into background noise. But here's what makes this particularly powerful. The brain's reward system responds not just to presence, but to anticipation. Dopamine surges most intensely not when we have something, but when we are about to get it. The text message we haven't received yet. The date that's still days away. The uncertainty about whether our feelings are returned. This is why longing can feel more intense than fulfillment. Why the early stages of love, with all their uncertainty, often burn brighter than long-term stability. The neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky explains that the brain is wired to find unpredictability rewarding. A slot machine is addictive not because it always pays out, but because you never know when it will. Similarly, intermittent reinforcement in relationships, moments of connection alternating with distance, can actually intensify attachment. This is why uncertainty doesn't diminish love. Often, it amplifies it. The brain learns to associate a specific person with the most powerful emotional experiences we can have. Every interaction becomes laced with anticipation, hope, fear, excitement, and gradually the person themselves becomes inseparable from the feeling they evoke. They become the trigger for a cascade of neurochemical responses that reshape our emotional landscape. In this sense, falling in love is not just about discovering another person. It is about the brain creating a new category of experience, one that centers entirely around their presence, their attention, their reciprocation. But there is another dimension to falling in love that goes beyond chemistry and psychology. It is the feeling of expansion. The psychologists Arthur and Elaine Aron developed what they call self-expansion theory, which suggests that a fundamental human motivation is the desire to grow, to increase our capabilities, our perspectives, our sense of who we are. And one of the most powerful ways we expand ourselves is through close relationships. When we fall in love, we don't simply add another person to our life. We incorporate aspects of them into our sense of self. Their interests become interesting to us. Their passions spark curiosity we didn't have before. Their perspective offers a new lens through which to see the world. We try foods we wouldn't have tried, visit places we wouldn't have visited, think thoughts we wouldn't have thought. In their presence, we discover parts of ourselves that were dormant or undeveloped. Research shows that people in new relationships score higher on measures of self-concept diversity. They describe themselves using more varied traits. They engage in more novel activities. They report feeling more capable, more interesting, more alive. This is one of love's profound gifts: expansion. Not just the expansion that comes from shared experiences, but the expansion of identity itself. You become more than you were. The boundaries of your world stretch to include another person's dreams, fears, histories, and possibilities. But here's the paradox. This expansion comes at the cost of autonomy. To truly love someone is to allow their needs, desires, and struggles to matter as much as your own. It is to factor another person into every significant decision you make. Where you live, how you spend your time, what risks you take, what dreams you pursue. Your life is no longer entirely your own. For some people, this feels like enrichment. For others, it feels like imprisonment. The philosopher Simone de Beauvoir wrote extensively about the tension between love and freedom. She argued that women, especially, were taught to find their identity through relationships, and in doing so, they lost themselves. But the tension she identified is not gender-specific. It is fundamental to love itself. Every deep relationship requires compromise, and compromise by definition means accepting something less than what you might want for yourself. So the question becomes, is what you gain worth what you give up? There is another dimension to love that goes deeper than expansion or compromise. It is vulnerability. To fall in love is to give another person extraordinary power over your emotional state. They can make you happier than anyone else. They can hurt you more than anyone else. Their attention becomes a source of validation. Their withdrawal becomes a source of pain. This is not weakness. It is the inevitable consequence of attachment. The psychologist John Bowlby, who pioneered attachment theory, observed that human beings are wired for connection. Infants form attachments to caregivers because their survival depends on it. But even as adults, we carry those attachment patterns forward. We seek proximity to people who matter to us. We experience distress when those connections are threatened. Love activates the attachment system in its most powerful form. And with attachment comes fear. Fear of rejection. Fear of abandonment. Fear that if the other person sees you completely, your flaws, your weaknesses, your darkness, they will leave. This is the vulnerability paradox. We want to be known completely, but we're afraid to reveal ourselves completely. We want certainty that our feelings will be returned, but certainty requires risking the possibility that they won't be. So we stand at the edge of intimacy, pulled between the desire for connection and the instinct for self-protection. And here's what makes this particularly difficult. The fear is not irrational. People do leave. Hearts do break. Love does not come with guarantees. The same person who expands your world can also shatter it. This is why some people choose not to fall in love. Not because they are incapable of it, not because they haven't found the right person, but because they have calculated the risk and decided it is not worth taking. Is that cowardice? Or is it self-preservation? Let's examine the alternative. What does a life without romantic love look like? For many people, it looks like stability. You maintain full control over your time, your space, your decisions. You don't have to negotiate with another person about where to live or how to spend money or whether to have children. You don't have to endure the emotional turbulence that comes with intimacy. You don't have to fear abandonment because you haven't given anyone the power to abandon you. Your emotional state remains relatively consistent. You are not subject to the highs and lows that relationships bring. You don't experience the obsessive thinking, the anxiety, the fear of loss. Your life is predictable in a way that love never allows. There is real value in this. Some of history's greatest thinkers, artists, and creators were either uninterested in romantic relationships or actively avoided them. Philosopher Immanuel Kant never married. Scientist Nikola Tesla remained single throughout his life. Painter Georgia O'Keeffe valued solitude and independence above all else. They were not incomplete. They were not broken. They simply prioritized other things. Because love is not the only source of meaning. There is meaning in creative work, in intellectual pursuit, in friendship, in service, in the cultivation of skills and the exploration of ideas. There are entire lives, rich and fulfilling, built without the foundation of romantic partnership. And those lives are protected from a particular kind of suffering. They are protected from heartbreak, from betrayal, from the slow erosion of intimacy that can occur in long-term relationships, from the grief of losing a partner to death or distance or the quiet dissolution of feeling. To choose against love is to choose against suffering. But it is also, inevitably, to choose against transformation. Because here is what love does that nothing else quite can. It forces you to confront yourself. Relationships function as mirrors. The person you love reflects back aspects of yourself you may not have seen clearly before. They illuminate your capacity for generosity and your capacity for selfishness. They reveal your strengths and your insecurities. They show you how you respond to conflict, to vulnerability, to disappointment, to joy. The psychologist Carl Jung spoke of the shadow, the parts of ourselves we repress or deny. Often, it is in intimate relationships that the shadow emerges. The ways you were hurt as a child resurface in how you react to a partner. The fears you thought you'd overcome reveal themselves under stress. The patterns you swore you'd never repeat appear when you feel threatened. This is uncomfortable. Sometimes it's unbearable. But it is also one of the primary ways human beings grow. Without the mirror of relationship, we can maintain comfortable illusions about who we are. We can avoid our wounds. We can tell ourselves stories that go unchallenged. Love shatters those illusions. It asks, are you as patient as you believe? As generous? As emotionally mature? As capable of seeing beyond your own needs? Most of the time, the answer is no. Not yet. And that not yet is where transformation happens. Every long-term relationship is, in a sense, a prolonged exercise in self-discovery. You learn where your boundaries are by having them tested. You learn what you truly value by having to defend it. You learn your capacity for forgiveness by having to choose whether or not to extend it. The philosopher Martin Buber wrote that real relationship occurs in what he called the I-thou encounter, where we see another person not as an object, a function, or a means to an end, but as a whole being, a consciousness as real and complex as our own. This kind of encounter is rare. It requires presence, openness, and the willingness to be changed. But when it occurs, something profound happens. You are no longer entirely alone in your existence. This brings us to perhaps the deepest dimension of love, its relationship to existential loneliness. The philosopher Thomas Metzinger wrote that human consciousness creates a fundamental sense of isolation. Each of us lives inside our own subjective experience, unable to fully share it. You can describe your feelings, your thoughts, your perceptions, but I can never experience them exactly as you do. In the most literal sense, we are each trapped inside our own minds. This is existential loneliness, not loneliness in the social sense, but a metaphysical solitude. The realization that no one can fully know what it is like to be you. And then you fall in love. Suddenly, someone seems to bridge that distance. They look at you and seem to see not just your surface, but something beneath it. They understand references you make without explanation. They respond to moods you haven't articulated. In their gaze, you feel recognized in a way that goes beyond words. This is one of love's most profound gifts. The feeling that you are not entirely alone in your existence. To be deeply understood, truly understood, is to feel that your inner world, which you usually navigate in solitude, has been witnessed by another consciousness. This is why being understood can feel more powerful than being admired. Admiration is about what you achieve. Understanding is about who you are. But this gift, like all gifts of love, comes with a cost. Because once you have been seen, once you have experienced that recognition, the prospect of losing it becomes terrifying. You become dependent not just on the person, but on the experience of being known. And if that experience disappears, through breakup, through death, through the gradual erosion of intimacy, the loneliness that returns feels even deeper than the loneliness you knew before. This is the risk of love. It shows you what is possible, and then asks you to live with the knowledge that it might be taken away. So the question is not whether love carries risk. It does. The question is whether the experience of being seen is worth the risk of eventually being unseen again. Let's return to the central paradox. Fall in love, and you gain intimacy, expansion, meaning, transformation, and the profound experience of being witnessed by another consciousness. Don't fall in love, and you preserve stability, independence, predictability, and protection from one of life's most devastating forms of suffering. Both paths have dignity. Both paths have cost. The path of love offers aliveness at the expense of safety. The path of solitude offers safety at the expense of a particular kind of aliveness. Which is right depends entirely on what you value. If you value stability above all else, if you find meaning in work, in creativity, in intellectual pursuit, in friendships that demand less vulnerability than romantic partnership, then choosing against romantic love is not a failure. It is an honest acknowledgement of what serves you. But if you value growth, if you want to see yourself clearly even when it's uncomfortable, if you are willing to endure uncertainty and pain for the sake of experiencing intimacy and connection, then love, with all its irrationality and risk, may be the most important thing you ever do. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke wrote, "Perhaps all the dragons in our lives are princesses who are only waiting to see us act, just once, with beauty and courage. Perhaps everything that frightens us is, in its deepest essence, something helpless that wants our love. Love is frightening because it asks us to relinquish control, to trust without guarantees, to give without certainty of return. But perhaps that is precisely why it matters. Most people believe they fall in love with another person, and in a sense they do. The connection is real, the bond is real. Another person can be one of the most meaningful presences in a life. But perhaps the deeper truth is this: we fall in love with a new way of seeing the world. We fall in love with the person we become in the presence of another. We fall in love with the expansion of our own capacity for feeling, for courage, for vulnerability, for growth. The beloved does not complete us, as the romantic cliché suggests. They complicate us. They challenge us. They invite us into a version of life that is richer, deeper, more difficult, and more beautiful than the life we knew before. And whether that invitation is worth accepting depends not on the other person. It depends on whether we are willing to be transformed, because a life without love may be safer. But safety has never been the same thing as aliveness. Love is dangerous because it changes us. It dismantles certainty. It exposes vulnerability. It forces us to confront ourselves through the mirror of another human being. And perhaps that is the real choice. Not whether to love or not to love, but whether we are willing to live a life where transformation is possible, even if transformation comes with the risk of pain. So fall in love or don't fall in love. Both are valid choices. But understand what you are choosing. You are not choosing between happiness and suffering. Both paths contain both. You are choosing between different kinds of risk. The risk of being hurt, or the risk of never knowing what you are capable of becoming in the presence of another person. The risk of loss, or the risk of a life that, in its careful self-protection, never becomes as large as it might have been. There is no right answer. There is only the question: what size of life are you willing to live? And whether you choose love or choose distance, whether you choose vulnerability or choose safety, you are ultimately deciding not who you will be with, but who you will become. Because love does not happen to us. We become it. And in that becoming, in that terrifying, exhilarating, irrational leap into uncertainty, we discover that the question was never really about another person at all. It was always about how much of ourselves we are willing to risk, how much transformation we can endure, how much aliveness we can stand. Fall in love or don't fall in love. But choose consciously, because either way, you are choosing the shape of your existence. And that choice, more than any other, will determine not whether you find happiness, but whether you find yourself